any other questions?
There's one.
Yeah. Who's the one?
Thank you so much, Lucian. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. But let me ask you a question as a layman, since I'm not initiated into this sort of scholarship. You talk about giving form or rupa through different technologies of deha, body. Um, so and then you also said a few moments earlier that these traditions are more corporeal and sensorial. Um, can we draw a conclusion that the minor traditions are more rooted or embedded in terms of its sensorial or corporeal, um, like corporeality? It's more embedded into the world as opposed to the major traditions. That's number one. And number two is how is this particular tradition looking at the mind-body dualism? Because you also talk about this making of the bhakta through bhakti. How much is corporeal and how much is it like? Is there a dualism or there's non-dualism?
I'll take the second question first.
Sure.
Yeah, in one sense, there's also pervading a lot of the writing, and not least, also you see it in, Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavad. There's a pervasion of a sort of Samkhya metaphysics. So you do have matter and spirit. When Swami Bhaktivedanta, who made all this popular in the West, came to his fundamental teaching was, you are not the body, you are not the body, you are not the body. So that was and I would say that's not just him, but it's there is also a sense of the body as in the Bhagavad you get it as well, the body as a bag of, blood, pus and stool. This is also the Vedanta and Shankara. Vivekananda also, he's saying like that?
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So definitely that's there. However, a closer inspection of this, there's in terms of the sensorium that we're dealing with, but Barbara Aldrich, a scholar at University of California, Santa Barbara, she wrote a book, I think it's called it's called Bhakti and Embodiment. And she looked specifically at Bhagavata Purana and the Gaudiya writers. And her thesis is that actually these more intense forms of, so the Gaudiya tradition, it has, the more, I wouldn't necessarily say that the Goswamis in present day Vrindavan are it's a minor tradition. They've got a lot of money. Yeah, and actually they've had quite a lot of money throughout history, to build big temples and all these sort of things. But her observation there was that the more passionate forms of bhakti end up being more body-centered in a sense, both in terms of the conceptualization of the deity, yeah, as well as the modes of practice in some way. It's interesting, yeah, that at the same time you have some of the minor I always hesitate to speak about the bowels that are short, because I'm still a beginner in that sphere as well. Like bowels. And
for example, like Motuwa tradition is also very corporeal, very sensorial.
But what's very interesting is that then, in relation to, so in the context of the desideratum of the Gaudiyas, you're also then heading towards the soteriological objective is to enter with the body into a bodily realm with an embodied God. And that's not like a more abstract realm, it's actually the most concrete theologically. It's like of which this is the shadow. So the body here is less concrete, it's more abstract than the celestial Vrindavan according to the Gaudiyas. As far as I understand, in some Shahajiya about contexts, although Sukanyas will problematize this, because as I understand, some Shahajiya practitioners are also tending towards aiming toward a celestial Vrindavan. Nitya Vrindavan. Some see this as purely in the in the body, and then the attainment of the Sahaj, and then there's the I mean, is the end state for, I would say, some of these minor traditions. I was also speaking with Karola about the Matawas. The end state, this sort of, if you frame it philosophically, with the sort of soteriological, it's like a sort of almost like sounds sometimes like a nirvikalpa samadhi. You know, which is that embodied, or is that sounds totally disembodied as well? You know, so the irony there of actually very bodily forms sometimes, very corporeal practices, and the prioritization of the Deha Tattva is actually aiming towards, I don't want to say disembodied, but somewhat more, less
transcending
sarkar, sarkar state, sarkar is states with an end state with form. So it's very complicated. So, but at the same time, I do think, yeah, like Karola's paper for the sensorium and the project and the workshop we're doing tomorrow is very much about the bodily fluid, the sweatiness, the bodily contact in these mahotshavs, yeah, I mean, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily want to draw too rigid a distinction between like high and whatever you want to call them, mainstream, marginal, or higher and folk, or I don't know what. But at the same time, I think the observation holds true in some context in relation to particular themes. Like that, yeah.
Thank you.
To completely relativize my answer. Yeah. The layman's questions are sometimes the most difficult, because they're also, it's not layman, right? It's also layman coming from another intellectual domain. Now I have to think a bit more broadly.
Any other question? Okay, so before we conclude, I have two small questions. One is that you repeatedly referred to that Bhagnapada sect of the Vaishnava. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Are they the genesis of the Sahajiya tendencies? I mean, this is what you tried to say. I couldn't figure out.
I don't say that the genesis, but they have a connection with the Sahajiya milieu somehow in relation to this Bir Chandra. Yeah, I mean, not much work has been done on this figure of Bir Chandra, but he's said to have brought in these shaven-headed tantric Buddhists or yogis. Yeah, so, but it's interesting that the first, it's also very much I think a tantric milieu, Bhagnapada. Then you go there and like they're in the temple, their main first deity, the oldest thing there is a Shiva Linga. You know, I mean, yeah, yeah. So I wouldn't attribute them, but I think they definitely form part of the puzzle. But they're an interesting context because they produce by the, I mean, early on as well. You have Ramachandra Goswami, who's writing this Ananga Manjari Samputika. There are a lot of Sanskrit writers in that context. It's kind of like both very orthodox and also kind of doing its own thing as well at the same time. But by the late 19th century, figures like Bipin Bihari Goswami, he writes his Hari Bhakti Tarangini. That's this big manual text that's all about Vaishnava Sadachar. Yeah, the whole thing is about just how to, this is key. And he's seeing it as like a text that should be read by, that's applicable to all Gaudiya Vaishnavas beyond just this Bhagnapada fold. Interestingly, the text, the book, the secondary literature by Melville Kennedy, called the Chaitanya Tradition, written in around 1920 something. He writes on the Bhagnapada community in places, and I'm always like, how is it? And then you look in the preface, he acknowledges as his key source Bhagavat Kamadadev Shastri, which is the son of Bipin Bihari Goswami, whose, I think his grandson was Kanam Bihari Goswami. Yeah, so there's so they go from what happened there as well. It's interesting. I was there last year. So I spoke with Kanam Bihari Goswami about 10 years ago. He says, because he dealt with a lot of literature, he says, there's nothing in Bhagnapada. There's nothing. There's the temple. There's the temple still from 1588. You know, some of the, but he said they just lost interest. They all, you know, they just got. And I went there. I thought, let me just check. I went there and we spoke with the current secretary of the community there. He was like a cousin or something, or a nephew of Kanabhi Hari Goswami. It looks very similar, very, you know, softly spoken, you know, he's a humble man. And he not, you know, putting on a show for the visitors, but when I asked him about texts like Vamshi Shikha, Murali Vilas, all these works, that he started tearing up and said, we lost interest in our tradition. They do the puja still, but he says, our whole family just lost interest and they didn't see the value. And now people are coming to study it, they're suddenly going, oh, and we lost all the, obviously all the manuscripts and everything went elsewhere, and who knows where.
Yeah, and lastly, I mean, this has always intrigued me. Although, as I said, that I know very little, as Georgette said, I'm still a student of it, early student to be more precise. But how do we respond to this Sahajiya text like Vivarta Vilas, which kind of claims that this is this was the original ways of practices that was practiced by. Because you also use the word esoteric, concealed practices.
Yeah.
So the Vivarta Vilas says that these were the practices that was suppressed, and now I'm trying to kind of disclose it in that way. So Sahajiya version of it. So how do we respond to that? That's why I asked the question whether Chaitanya also practiced the Manjari Sadhana or this is something that he claims that he used to make.
Yeah, so what's very interesting is so that it's rooted deeply in the Charitamrita, the Vivarta Vilas.
And to sorry to interrupt, and also to connect it to your article where you talked about the gentrification of these Sahajiya practices of sexuality and other trends. So this is a bit confusing. And
okay, so I'll put it like this. My basic guiding insight here, and this isn't, I'm not taking a stand, like a hard ideological stand on the Gaudiyas need to be orthodox or whatever it is, but I do feel that, like, you look at early tantric, or no, like early writers responding to certain milieu, you know, is it the Agava Dambara, Jayanta Bhatta, these you know, Alexis Anderson's dealt with a bit of this and elsewhere, but like, I mean, there's been concern about, you know, unclean and deviant sexual stuff from outset. It's like it's partly a Brahminical thing, right? It's you don't need to suddenly go, oh, the British brought it here. I mean, this is too simplifying. It's too idealizing the past, right? And then you look at some of the texts that the Goswamis are writing, Hari Bhakti Vilas, or the. I guess I am starting to make an argument about why I could see the kitchen as later, but you look at Sandarbha, Jiva Goswami, or like, if they're trying to conceal something deeper, it's a very, very convoluted concealment process, because they write a lot of literature that doesn't explicitly deal with it. So that's a very sophisticated attempt at concealment. Another way of looking at it is that there's Theravada, Buddhism, you know, the earlier corporate, and then there's a little, you know, somewhat later you have sort of tantric elements, etc., that see it as like original teaching. I mean, it's a fairly common tantric strategy, right, or esoteric strategy to be. Whether or not it's getting at the heart of what Chaitanya is teaching is another thing. I'm not taking a stand on that. Edward Dimmock, in his Place of the Hidden Moon, 1966, republished in the 80s. Interesting there, and Joe O'Connell took great, you know, he was a little bit, he took issue with the way that, in that the strategy of the book is beautifully written and very informative and deals with a great amount of literature, and really the Chandidas section, and he deals with just an enormous amount of literature, which is amazing considering none of these texts were available, and PDFs, you know, searchable or anything, or nothing in translation, nothing, yeah? So it's and beautifully written, but it's somewhat peculiar approach to the corpus in that it's, while there's an approach, one might say a sort of critical approach to the quote-unquote orthodox, it's a basically taking at face value the narrative of the Tantrikas, the Shahajiyas. And I think if you're going to apply a critical approach, you've got to apply it equally everywhere. You know what I mean? Not just to idolize something just because it apparently seems to be, you know, heterodox or marginalized. You approach it with similar rigor, like that, you know. And that's all. So it's like, you know, if we have to question what Krishnadas is saying about Chaitanya, which, you know, Tony does brilliantly and Omiya Da, you know, we must also do the same with regard to what Okinchan Das is saying about Jiva Goswami or Krishnadas. You know what I mean? Is that
a form of appropriation?
Is that a form of
appropriation?
Yeah, it's a form of subversive appropriation. Very serious, a subversive approach, which is, yeah. Oh no, that's what I say. I mean, it's fairly, what Akinchan Das is doing there, rooting himself deeply in the Charitamrita. I mean, subversive appropriation of the literal reading of the Charitamrita. The Charitamrita maybe has a few instances of ambiguity. These are very small places, you know, they're very, very, very tiny. And then to turn it into a whole background narrative is an esoteric discursive strategy, right? I'm not saying one is right, one's wrong, one's this, one's that, but it's like we have to pay attention to the rhetorical strategies of the text that we're dealing with. You know, I mean, it's and it's also, I would also question, and I've been also questioning Glenn Hayes about this. How many manuscripts do you know of the Vibhorta Vilas? There's not that many, I think, right? There's like one or two. Shukumar Shane's one, and I think there's possibly another, I don't know. I mean, that's not indicative of a very widely circulating text. There are also, yeah, there are certain features of it which are quite interesting that I think maybe the provenance of the text is slightly later, you know, but then it comes to hold a position of great prominence in the scholarship of the tradition. We read through the likes of Shukumar Shane, Edward Dimmock, etc. And then we take it as a given that it's an extremely prominent text. But it would be interesting to see someone do like real work on that. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. It was very, very enlightening that we learned a lot. And that is the purpose of this lecture series. And we hope that we'll also learn in future from Professor Shen as well. So thank you, Lucian, and thank you everyone for being a part of this lecture and the conversation that we had.
Thank you so much.
And we sincerely hope that the conversation will continue.
Yes, definitely, sincerely, yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there is tea outside.